kind of all we can do, isn't it? Begin again in love. I recognize that this was a difficult narrative to listen to. And of course, its main subject, rape, is hardly a favorite topic for anyone's Sunday morning. This particular rape case intersects with many other issues of oppression and violation, and I would like to enumerate just a few of the main areas of importance as they relate to this heart-wrenching and at times courageous recital of facts. The most obvious issue is sexual assault, but of course, after the sentencing, one could hardly ignore the question of white privilege and male privilege, which is to say, that category, white male privilege, which accrues the major part of advantage in this American life. Racism is a product of the privilege which I too am affected by, but work hard to shed. Sexism, which has never been eradicated, also pervades this narrative. It might be added that evidence of the level of sexism in the minds of men and women in America have once again been made manifest in this harrowing primary season for the presidency of the United States. With the fairly recent announcement of the sentence for Brock Turner, a 20-year-old privileged young man, for sexually assaulting an unconscious, absolutely vulnerable victim, known to us only as Jane Doe, brings up the fifth and last of the issues we will have time to speak to this morning, albeit briefly in each instance. That of incarceration, the current American scandal. In Chicago, in 1970, there were on record 1,000+ charges of rape, and of that number, fewer than 100 ever went to trial. By year's end, there were 3 convictions. At this point in history, part of the standard instructions a judge would issue to a jury in such a case was that they remember that rape is a charge easily made and difficult to disprove, and therefore it would behoove them to treat the complainant's charge with some skepticism. Since the grassroots work of many women in every state in these United States, the early 70s marked the time when this instruction is no longer part of the instruction for cases in sexual assault. My stepmother, some 25 years ago, was lamenting the effects of sexual misconduct allegations on upstanding men in the community by irresponsible and not believable young victims. That she had never attended a rape case, to have heard the judge's instructions in such cases, yet was clearly in sync with the mindset of those instructions, demonstrates how deeply the mythology construed around rape has prevented for millions of women through the centuries the basic human right of simple justice. In Susan Brown Miller's definitive work, Against Our Will, Men, Women, and Rape, published in 1975, there is the horrifying history of rape as part of every culture, every period, and in such areas as women as the spoils of war, women as targets in riots, pogroms, and revolutions, the despicable history of slave women enduring a lifetime, in some cases, of rape by their debased and nefarious masters. The history of rape and its link with lynching to the ante- and post-slavery periods in the South, and finally, the socialization of women in their role of passivity, which through the centuries precluded women's resistance to this violation. It was unladylike to fight back. Brown Miller concludes her masterpiece with these words, "Fighting back. On a multiplicity of levels, that is the activity we must engage in together if we, women, are to redress the imbalance and rid ourselves and men of the ideology of rape. Rape can be eradicated, not merely controlled or avoided on an individual basis, but the approach must be long-range and cooperative and must have understanding and goodwill of many men as well as women. My purpose in this book," she finishes, "has been to give rape its history. Now we must deny it a future." That is still to come. The concept of privilege, for so long unrecognized, still conjures vigorous resistance by many of us for whom it is the norm of our existence. Since we as a culture have never truly intersected with the cultures of people of color, we fail to notice that our norm was not universally experienced. It has long been the narrative of white America that anyone who works hard and plays by the rules can be successful, can achieve the American dream. It has not escaped the notice of the wide disparity between achievable dreams of white America and those of the American people of color. From post-construction era America to the present, people of color, in a practical sense, had basic dreams, often never achieved, that were common expectations, common, not to be questioned in white America. Racism is so deeply embedded in our culture that many white Americans can pretend that it no longer exists, a privilege no person of color can take for granted. If you have never read Lorraine Hansberry's masterpiece, A Raisin in the Sun, please put it on your summer reading list. This is only one of a library full of Black American stories that many white people have not yet read. Perhaps the greatest privilege in white America is that few of us are frequently called upon to consider the ramifications of racial disparity. On the other hand, no person of color has even a day off from this critical consideration. Why does it matter that the Unitarian Universalist Association stands firmly on the side of the movement called Black Lives Matter, when the actions of society blatantly demonstrate the valueless quality that they attribute to black lives, with no correlative obvious disregard for the lives of white citizens? The call to recognize the oppression of particularly of young black men by a system that is tainted by racism and by some members with the authority of a badge who seem willing to take this propensity to its ultimate extreme becomes a matter of survival. If you have ever worked in the public sector on behalf of battered women, for example, you may have been asked, what about battered men? If you have worked in educating the public about affirmative action, you will be reminded of the Bakke decision and the discrimination suffered by white men. To me, the Bakke decision represents how deeply held is our belief as white people that we enter into a world of tomorrows. As we enter into a world, we should always be able to maintain that special treatment, always. The distracting question, what about battered men, is a supreme example of the privileged to refuse to look at a crime such as battering of women, which is a pandemic in America, by demanding equal attention for the statistically anomalous occurrence of battering of men by women. The instances of this second are so rare that it is obscene to ignore the societal implications of its flip side, the battering of women at every level of the class structure and in every ethnic and racial group. When, with shamefully regular stories on the national news about a 12-year-old boy with a toy gun being killed by a police officer, or a man in the street who's misidentified as a suspect and taken down with a chokehold that ends his life, or a man taken into custody in a police van with a number of officers is so severely injured that he subsequently dies, and as of today, no one has yet been held accountable. Can we pretend that there's something exclusive and unnecessary about the anguish of the demand to notice that Black lives matter? Not too long ago, as I listened to a reporter from National Public Radio, I was more than a little upset by his response to a question about the young women in California who were Bernie Sanders supporters and their disregard for the candidacy of a woman. He said very simply, well, I think they're beyond that point. I wondered at the time if he, like so many others, believed that equality for women had been accomplished and was no longer relevant. A number of women have been quoted in the media with at least a modicum of pride that they would not, of course, vote for a woman, quote, just because she was a woman. Now, to be clear, I would not vote for Phyllis Schlafly or Sarah Palin for President of the United States, or most probably for any office. But it became clear to me in this election cycle that most Black Americans who voted for Barack Obama wouldn't feel a need to apologize for supporting so obviously a qualified candidate and pretend that his being Black was not a matter of pride to them. To truly subjugate a people, it is said, one must convince the world of their inferiority. Then the oppressor must convince himself of the group's inferiority. But the coup de grace, that which makes the subjugation complete, is to convince the group itself that it is inferior. An oppression of so long-standing as that of women has not completely accomplished that goal, but there have been, of course, some singular successes. But have hope. Adrienne Rich, poet extraordinaire, feminist extraordinaire, has said, women have always lied to each other. Women have always whispered the truth to each other. Those murmurations, handed down from generation to generation, century after century, were, I suspect, our saving grace. We come now to the issue of incarceration. This particular case of Brock Turner, on trial for 3 felony counts of criminal sexual conduct on the unconscious Jane Doe, probably would have remained primarily a California story or part of campus legend, but for the stunning sentencing decision made by Judge Persky. His decision to sentence Mr. Turner to 6 months in county jail and 3 years of probation became the outrage of the day and subsequent days. And as you have heard, the deliberation of Judge Persky, as read by Frank Rossman, I wonder if you gained any real understanding of his reasons for that decision. Having reread Judge Persky's explanation of the sentencing 6 times, I still feel confused about his reasoning. I could discern only 3 factors that were decidedly in Brock's favor. 1, that he had no prior criminal record. This does not mean he had no unlawful behavior prior to this assault. In his high school partying, there was a visual record of his behavior, including smoking from a bong and drinking alcohol, in one case, directly from a whiskey bottle. 2, that he had many character references. As a teacher, I wrote several of these for my students at their request when they were in some legal trouble, and I became somewhat familiar with the dismissal with which most of these character letters were treated by judges. But this judge liked them. He seemed to find one letter in particular as evidence of Brock's good character. The part of the letter the judge read into the record stated that the young woman had known Brock since elementary school, and she noted that of all the young men she graduated with, Brock was the last person she would have expected to have been in this position. Judge Persky's response to that statement seemed to be that it corroborated all the opinions of good character of this young man and proved what a good person he had been all along. I think one thing it does prove is he has poor judgment. But he didn't mention that. Well, the judge read more extensively Jane Doe's statement to the court and seemed empathic to her plight. He seemed to base his sentencing on part of one of her sentences. The damage is done. He seemed to understand that as some kind of reconciliation statement with the event, and perhaps that no further damage ought to accrue to either of the parties, Jane Doe or Brock Turner. This brings us to the third reason for his decision, and that is that this stellar young man was no danger to society and would be irreparably harmed by a prison sentence. And we might ask, who wouldn't be? I could take more seriously the soundness of his opinion and decision if, in knowing the horror of the broken American prison system, he had never sentenced anyone to such a horrific fate. But as it turns out, a Hispanic American defendant who had, according to the record, disregarded his girlfriend's wishes, kissed and fondled her until she began to weep, received a prison sentence from Judge Persky. He had immediately stopped touching her when she began to cry and waited for the police to arrive. The record doesn't indicate how they were notified. This defendant, however, informed the police he knew he was wrong. He said he was sorry. He is turning himself in. At his sentencing, the judge perhaps felt he was made of sturdier stuff than the Nordic-looking Brock Turner. Perhaps the judge did not believe he was sorry for what he had done, as he so adamantly believed Turner's apology to be sincere. Or for some other unfathomable reason known only to himself, he sentenced this Hispanic young man to 2 years in prison. I find myself at this point between the proverbial rock and a hard place, or the devil and the deep blue sea. The notion of incarceration, which has caused the creation of wealth of so many owners of private prisons, has given the United States the unworthy distinction of well outstripping every other nation in the percentage of its population living in cages. Dostoevsky says, the degree of civilization in a society can be judged by entering its prisons. What does our brutal and inhumane and over-inhabited prison system tell the world about us? What does it tell the world about a people so punitive that prison reform seems not to be on anyone's priority list? For example, people who are incarcerated in Michigan are excluded from making use of the Freedom of Information Act. This law could be most helpful to people who are imprisoned. But the law itself does not prohibit its use by the incarcerated. Michigan's legislature had to meet, debate it, and vote on it to make that the law in Michigan. That might well serve to make us incensed. How do we, as members of a liberal religion, go about replacing the appalling apathy in matters of justice with the healing empathy our world so desperately needs? In Germany and in Norway, there are radical notions afoot about this criminal element. That radical notion is that every person has inherent worth and dignity. Sound familiar? This is, of course, our Unitarian Universalist first principle. These prison systems, these experiments that might save our species are categorically opposed to the notion of punishment and resolutely in favor of reconciliation. I am almost finished. The message to the public, and to women in particular, from the Stanford rape case indicates how negligible are the sufferings of rape victims to this judge and many others who have preceded him. Judge Persky had an opportunity to resist the impulse of incarceration with the possibility of a real, helpful, healing solution. Mr. Turner, in the words of Jane Doe, clearly didn't get it. So perhaps the judge's role should not have been dismissive of the feelings of women so seriously violated. If he had talked with Jane Doe about the sentencing, she could have told him, don't have him go around talking to boys about the evils of drinking. Talk to them about respecting women. Tell them to turn off the pornography on their cell phones and look at their female classmates as whole people, wholly human, deserving of respect and dignity. What a wonderful world he could have helped create. Henry James points us in the direction that could revolutionize our angry, punitive mindset. He says there are 3 things in human life that are important. The first is to be kind. The second is to be kind. And the third is to be kind. Amen. Namaste. Ainsi soit-il, as the French would say. Anne and Julie are going to do enjoy the healing and the beauty of this piece.
Oh, gather up the brokenness and bring it to me now. The fragrance of those promises you never dared to vow. The splinters that you carried, the cross you left behind. Come healing of the body, come healing of the mind, and let the heavens hear it, the penitential hymn. Come healing of the spirit, come healing of the limb. Behold the gates of mercy in arbitrary space, and none of us deserving the cruelty or the grace. Oh, solitude of longing, where love has been confined. Come healing of the body, come healing of the mind. Oh, see the darkness yielding that tore the light apart. Come healing of the reason, come healing of the heart. Oh, troubled dust concealing an undivided love, the heart beneath this teaching to the broken heart above. Let the heavens falter and let the earth proclaim. Come healing of the altar, come healing of the name. Oh, longing of the branches to lift the little bud. Oh, longing of the arteries to purify the blood. And let the heavens hear it, the penitential hymn. Come healing of the spirit, come healing of the limb. Oh, let the heavens hear it, the penitential hymn. Come healing of the spirit, come healing.